So in these slides, I'm presenting some of my own ideas about the possible implications of federal control over First Nations oil and gas. And I will be suggesting that federal control of this industry has a range of relevant political and ethical considerations. These are ideas that have developed out of a research collaboration with Lucia Muhlenbach at the University of Calgary. And so some of the figures that you see on these slides have been drawn from that research project. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the oil and gas industry by way of background, the oil and gas industry on First Nations land by way of background. This is a crude map of the Pigeon Lake Reserve and the wells that are on or near the reserve. So Pigeon Lake is about 50 miles southwest of Edmonton, and it is home to 4 First Nations. The Pigeon Lake Reserve also sits on the Bonnie Glen oil field, which is one of the top 10 most productive oil fields in all of Canada in terms of cumulative production. So what you can see is the size of the bubble corresponds to cumulative production. And what I'm showing you are the wells that are on reserve and within 10 kilometers of the reserve. So what you see is that there's really a lot of production here, both on reserve and off reserve. And this is only one of many First Nations reserves with oil and gas resources. So there are approximately 70 First Nations reserves that have ever had any production in Alberta alone. And 9 of those reserves are still actively producing according to our data. So we estimate, just to give you like a sense of the size of this industry, we estimate that at $60 per barrel of crude oil, production on First Nations reserves in Alberta in the last full year of our sample, that's 2020 to 2021, that would amount to $269 million in revenue. And that's only Alberta. So there are more than 150 First Nations reserves with any oil or gas production that have had any oil or gas production across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, although the majority of those are in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So this graph shows you quarterly oil plus gas production for all 3 of those provinces combined from the 1960s up to 2021. The red line indicates production from wells that are located off First Nations land, and the blue line indicates production from wells on First Nations land. So what you can see is that there's the wells off First Nations reserves are really dominating the wells on First Nations reserves, but this is not normalized by land area, and obviously First Nations land takes up a small fraction of the overall land area. So much of that discrepancy is just mechanical. But then if you zoom in geographically, and you only consider production on reserves or within 2 kilometers of reserves, you get a picture that looks more like this. So here you can see that production is much closer, and it's actually overlapping from the 60s until the mid-1980s. So we do know that what I've just shown you is that there's quite a bit of involvement in the oil and gas industry on First Nations land. And we do know that there are several indicators of economic development that have been associated with oil and gas activity on First Nations land, including things like higher median incomes and low unemployment rates. So according to Stats Canada, the 3 First Nations in the oil sands have higher median incomes than all other reserves in Canada. And Fort McKay First Nation, for example, even has a higher median income than 10 provinces. So, so that's just establishing the link between First Nations involvement in the oil and gas industry and economic development. But that's not really the focus of our research. So we don't set out to identify the direct impact of oil and gas on First Nations. Instead, our research focus is on how federal control affects oil and gas exploration and production on First Nations land. So that's the area that I'd like to elaborate on a little bit more. But before we get into that, just in case you're not familiar with the context, I want to give a little bit of a primer. This is really a vast oversimplification, but due to historical legislation, specifically the Indian Act, the federal government is trustee of First Nations lands and resources. So for the purposes of this talk, what you need to know is that the federal government owns mineral rights on First Nations reserves. the federal government holds revenues from land-based resources in trust, and the federal government regulates on-reserve oil and gas exploration and production. So when I talk about federal control, this is more specifically what I'm referring to. So in principle, there are several channels through which federal control could impact First Nations with oil and gas resources. For simplicity, I'm focusing on two channels, which I think may be particularly important. So first, I'm focusing on industry regulations. Due to federal control, oil and gas regulations have been relatively weak on First Nations land. And second, administrative costs have been relatively high for oil and gas activity on First Nations land. So I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but first, let's discuss regulations. There are different regulatory regimes that govern oil and gas activity in Canada. So Crown land is regulated by provincial authorities, whereas First Nations land is regulated by federal authorities. And actually, the federal regime that's responsible for the disposition of oil and gas rights and the collection of rents on First Nations land comprises three parts. The legislative authority is Indian Oil and Gas Canada, or the IOGC, and the IOGC operates under the authority of the legislative instrument, the Indian Oil and Gas Act, or the IOGA, and the regulatory instrument, the Indian Oil and Gas Regulations, or the IOGR. So this is a little bit technical, but I'm introducing this information to explain why I have characterized federal regulations as being relatively weak. So I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the IOGA, that's the legislative instrument, remained largely unchanged from 1974 when it was originally passed until 2009. And during that period of time, the legislation was only about 20 pages long. The IOGR actually remained unchanged until 2019, which was 10 years after the IOGA was amended. So the changes to the IOGA actually did not come into force until 2019. So to contrast that with provincial regulations, let's just focus on the case of Alberta here. In Alberta, Crown land is regulated by the Alberta Energy Regulator, and the legislative instrument is the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. But the important point I'd like to note here is that this legislative instrument has been updated every 2 years to keep up with industry developments. The most current version of this legislation is approximately 90 pages long. So that's in contrast with the 20-page legislation that's governing First Nations oil and gas. So relative to the rest of the province, First Nations in Alberta have dealt with a thin and outdated regulatory framework, at least until the 2019 changes took effect. And actually, in official IOGC documents, the amendment to the IOGA was characterized as a modernization of the legislation. So what you can see on the screen now is it's a screenshot from a federal website, and it's effectively describing the modernization of the IOGA as a closing of a regulatory gap. And it talks about how eliminating this gap could reduce barriers to economic development. It could also provide greater certainty for stakeholders, help ensure environmental protection, increase regulatory compliance, and facilitate the collection of royalties. So all of this basically suggests that even the federal government thought that the weak regulations may have been impacting First Nations negatively and in several different ways. So in principle, of course, there could be several different types of implications. In particular, in theory, the regulatory gap could have implications for production, environmental outcomes, and royalty payments. To go from the theory to empirics, we need data. In our research, we do have data on production, so we should be able to say something about how weak regulations have impacted production outcomes. We may be able to say something about environmental outcomes. We could obtain reported environmental incidents data. It's unclear whether we'll be able to say anything about royalty payments. We have filed a request to access those data, but it's unclear whether we will be able to get access to those data. But effectively, what do we know so far about how federal regulations have impacted First Nations in practice? Basically, we're still trying to answer that question, but it seems that the short answer is that it is unclear. So there appears to have been questionable adherence to and enforcement of the federal regulations. And in particular, in cases where federal regulations were unclear, there may have been de facto adoption of provincial regulations. Also, if weak regulations had been impacting production in the past, we would expect to see a discontinuity or a change in 2019 when the stronger version of the federal regulations came into effect. We don't see evidence of that in our data. So at the moment, we have not found evidence of an impact on production outcomes, but we're still in the middle of the research. So I would still consider this to be a relatively open question. But beyond regulations, federal control could also impact First Nations through a mechanism I'm broadly categorizing as administrative costs. And when I say administrative costs, I'm referring broadly to the transaction costs that would be associated with a federal bureaucracy. And in particular, I'd like to touch on 2 points here: possible inefficiencies in federal management, and also the fact that oil and gas royalties are not transferred directly to First Nations. Instead, they're held in Ottawa with other Indian monies. So I'm going to briefly explain each of these points by going through a series of examples from news headlines. The first point that I'd like to raise is that the IOGC is not being managed by producing First Nations. In 1996, the IOGC did sign an MOU that created a co-management board with the idea that First Nations would eventually take over full management of the industry. But as you can see suggested by the headline of this article, for many years, the IOGC has remained the ultimate decision maker. So this could be costly to First Nations if the IOGC faces a different set of incentives than the First Nations. In other words, the IOGC does not necessarily internalize the objectives of the First Nations. And I do want to acknowledge that this brings up a host of complicated ethical considerations that I'm not going to go into in detail here, but in short, First Nations do want control over their natural resources. However, it is also the treaty right of First Nations to have Canada maintain fiduciary responsibility, and that includes liability. So I do want to acknowledge that this is a complicated issue. In addition, it has recently come to our attention that the IOGC is facing a multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit over systemic racism in the organization. An independent report found that there's really high turnover of Indigenous employees within the organization. There's limited access to development and career progression opportunities, and things like that. So I'm obviously not in a position to comment on the particulars of the case, but these allegations suggest that the IOGC is not functioning in an efficient manner. Either way, battling lawsuits is administratively costly. So not only does this have an impact on the Indigenous workers working at the IOGC, but this also has an impact, or it could have implications, for the producing First Nations that rely on the IOGC to manage the industry. And then the final point that I wanted to raise is that oil and gas revenues are, in most cases, not transferred directly to producing First Nations. So once they're collected by the IOGC, they're held in a consolidated revenue fund or held in trust with other Indian monies. From this headline, you can see that the Bearspaw First Nation in Alberta has been fighting the federal government for the right to manage its own savings. And I think First Nations have many concerns about the implications of this trust. So many have pointed out, for example, that the government is getting relatively low interest rates for their savings. And also, if a nation wishes to withdraw money to, let's say, invest in an economic development venture on reserve, there's an administrative cost associated with accessing their money. So really, you can consider this another source of inefficiency. So I'll just quickly conclude with a few thoughts. I think that the big picture takeaway here is that federal control over Indigenous oil and gas could have myriad ethical and political implications. For the most part, these implications have not yet been quantified. And so one of the goals of our research is to quantify some of those implications. I also think that this is a timely question. I think that understanding the effects of federal control is going to become increasingly important. So federal control over energy projects could impact Indigenous energy sovereignty as well as transitions to renewable energy.